Hi, I'm Justin Jacobs, and today I'm sitting down with Elke Stockreiter to discuss her new book, Islamic Law, Gender, and Social Change in Post-Abolition Zanzibar, published in 2015. Thank you for joining us, Elke.
Thank you for inviting me, Justin.
One of the things that I found particularly interesting about your research is that what you're looking at is the colonization of Muslim lands and Muslim peoples in the late 19th and 20th century. This is an issue that I've found in my own research in modern China as well. I've actually encountered arguments in which Muslims in Central Asia are debating whether or not the Russian Empire or the Chinese Empire has sort of a heavier hand on their colonial subjects. And surprisingly, in the early 20th century, there was a consensus among many Muslims who were living in the Russian Empire, Russian Central Asia, that actually the Chinese Empire seemed to have a lighter hand in the way that they governed their Muslim subjects. And when I was reading your book, what I found interesting was this idea of sort of a comparative study of colonization of Muslim lands during the same time frame. What can you tell us about Zanzibar in the late 19th and early 20th century and the sort of research that you've been working on?
So Zanzibar is an island of the East African coast. Politically, it belongs to the nation-state of Tanzania. And Zanzibar has also been, for a very long time, for millennia actually, been part of the Indian Ocean trade networks. And it's in the context of the Indian Ocean trade that Muslims arrived on the East African coast, including Zanzibar, definitely by the 8th century Common Era. So by the 19th century, Zanzibar was a predominantly Muslim society. It's also often associated with cosmopolitanism. And from the early 19th century onwards, the Omanis from the Arabian Peninsula, so from across the Indian Ocean, made Zanzibar the seat of their sultanate. So Zanzibar became the seat of the Omani Sultanate in the early 19th century. And in that respect, we can consider the Omanis as the first colonizers of Zanzibar. Later in the 19th century, the British followed suit, and in 1890, Zanzibar became integrated into the British Empire by becoming a British protectorate. So the British are usually associated with indirect rule as opposed to direct rule from the French. And in that sense, we can say that the British were more hands-off in comparison to the French that also ruled over huge parts of Africa.
Sort of similar to what we were talking about with China versus Russia.
Yes,
yeah,
absolutely. And in the context of indirect rule, Zanzibar didn't become a colony but a protectorate. So that meant that the British actually maintained the political structure at the time. So it remained a sultanate. The Sultan, the Omani Sultan, remained officially in charge. But at the same time, of course, the British interfered. I would say as much actually as the French did. So in practice, there wasn't really a big difference between direct and indirect rule. All colonial powers interfered considerably in the societies over which they ruled. Now, my study specifically focuses on the Islamic courts. And I should add that Islamic courts were not created by the British, but the British decided to maintain the Islamic legal system and integrate it into the colonial legal system. And what they did is, by integrating Islamic courts into the colonial judiciary, they also embarked on modernization. So they modernized the Muslim judiciary.
What exactly do you mean by modernization? I mean, what does that entail specifically on the ground?
Sure. So modernization in that specific context entailed that the British established courthouses. Muslim judges were adjudicating prior to British colonial rule, but they were available in open space. In fact, next to a market, so in a very busy, noisy place. And that certainly didn't work for the British understanding of the administration of justice. So they established a courthouse and moved Muslim judges from the public sphere into the private sphere. Modernization also entailed several reforms, among them the removal of penal law from the jurisdiction of Muslim judges, So during British colonial rule, Muslim judges only adjudicated civil law cases. And this whole notion of interference, British interference into the Zanzibari judiciary, certainly contradicted the British promise not to interfere with Zanzibar's judiciary. So again, it's sort of a contradiction of the whole notion of indirect rule
Right.
and non-intervention. So they interfered, and they actually made the appointed British judges who also adjudicated appeal cases from the Muslim courts. And penal law was exclusively administered by British magistrates. And in that sense, it's really ironic because by definition, a Muslim judge should be Muslim and not Christian, as in the context of Zanzibar and the British Empire more generally.
So tell us how you got interested in studying sort of the history of the judiciary under British rule, under British colonial rule in Zanzibar. How did you get interested in this, and what sort of findings did you discover?
So this project is actually the first that is mainly based on the Arabic court records from Zanzibar.
Okay.
And my interest in Islamic courts goes back to my days as a graduate student, when I was first introduced into really fascinating studies, historical studies, anthropological studies based on Islamic courts in North Africa, Middle East, all the way actually to Malaysia. It's really impressive what the court records can do in terms of revising our understanding of social history and gender history specifically. So when I became aware of the availability of court records in Zanzibar, I really thought I have to take up that challenge and use it for this project. So the court records are specifically fascinating because they provide an excellent window into the interactions of all social strata.
Okay.
Poor and the rich went to the court, so you really have the cross-section
Right.
of society there. And one of the most important findings is the predominance of litigants from socio-economically marginalized groups. So in other words, women, slaves, former slaves flocked to the courts, the Islamic courts in Zanzibar. This is a finding that ties in well with research on Islamic courts. Generally, we did also chimes with research on colonial courts in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's sort of just the East African example of the popularity of colonial courts among socio-economically marginalized groups. So women specifically filed cases for divorce, and husbands in turn would claim the return of their wives. And this is legally known as the restitution of conjugal rights. And yes, one of the really interesting things is also that women filed for shares of inheritance, for instance, and were involved in a lot of cases that shows female economic agency. So it really attests to the social acceptance of Muslim women in colonial Zanzibar as economic agents.
That's absolutely fascinating. One of the things that I've noticed in scholarship that's emerging on many places outside of the Western world is that we're getting more access now to court records, in which what you find are these socially marginalized groups where conventional wisdom had said that they didn't or couldn't engage the courts for a variety of reasons. Perhaps the elites were dismissive of them, or there were rules, social taboos against them doing so. And what's fascinating, what you're showing in your book, is that not only did they engage the courts, they were able to express sort of their own sense of social agency as well. What sort of research findings have you come about that might go against the grain of received wisdom with Zanzibar or Africa in general?
So within the context of the social embeddedness of the courts, the popularity of the courts, if you ask Zanzibaris today, they would say, well, it's a very recent thing that women actually go to court and file cases. In the past, it didn't exist, right? So it's sort of an argument along the lines of linearity and progress. Today, women have more power, legal power, economic power, and in that sense, looking at the court cases, we clearly see that the evidence shows that former slaves and women used the courts frequently in the colonial period, so in the past. So I think it just shows how important it is to do historical research, to sort of question notions of progress and linearity. Another important finding is that I think sort of questions the popular discourse of the role of Muslim women generally is the strong economic agency that women had. They were involved in buying property, in selling property, and men accepted that. So gender was not questioned in the courts. However, as at least some court cases indicate, social status was questioned. So there's some evidence that Muslim judges were biased against former slaves and their descendants. In other words, a big argument that I'm making is that social status was more important than gender.
In addition to the women that you analyze engaging the courts, Zanzibar also had a well-developed slave industry, I understand, as well. How are slaves influenced by the transformation in colonial courts in Zanzibar under the British?
Well, this whole opportunity of using the Islamic courts to move up the socioeconomic hierarchy essentially existed after the abolition of the legal status of slavery, and that was introduced by the British and happened in 1897, so 7 years after Zanzibar became a British protectorate. Prior to that, slaves needed the permission of their owners, male or female slave owners, in order to represent themselves in court. So for slaves, the abolition of the legal status of slavery really provided the opportunity to use the courts to claim a stake in Zanzibari society as a Muslim citizen. So anyone who addressed the Muslim court very much reaffirmed his or her identity as a Muslim. So it was about making a claim to be part of Zanzibar's Muslim society. Another thing that is very interesting to note is that among slaves, former slaves and their descendants, as well as Westerners, including the British colonizers, by the 19th century there was a strong sense that slave owners were Arabs. So the association of slave ownership with an Arab identity. And this sort of this understanding and the ensuing frictions in Zanzibari society between descendants of slaves and the former slave owners, they materialized in the court records. So the records also attest to cleavages in Zanzibari society along ethnic lines and socio-economic status, and eventually that culminated in the revolution, in the Zanzibar Revolution of 1964, that just occurred 1 month after Zanzibar became independent, and that was directed against the Arabs. It ousted the Arabs from Zanzibar. So after that, there was definitely an emphasis on African identity rather than Arab identity. Whereas today, Zanzibaris emphasize their Muslim identity to distinguish themselves from the mainland, the predominantly Christian mainland. So there is an increasing outlook, again, towards the Muslim world.
This is all very fascinating. Thank you so much for sitting down with us today, and best of luck in your research.
Thank you, Justin, and thank you very much for your time.